there, this is Mary of Mary Humphrey Coaching. Welcome to my channel. Today I'm talking about ADHD. Now, I have to tell you, as I've told you in the past, sometimes the topics that I talk about come to me with my own experiences, and sometimes they're shared experiences from clients. And this is what I'm doing today. I had a client that was very confused about how to handle a person that she worked with that was diagnosed with ADHD. So let's start with, what is ADHD? ADHD is an adult attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Had to read that. It's a lot of words. It's a mental health disorder. A lot of people these days, I feel, they tend to try to claim I'm a little bit ADHD. Well, unless they've been diagnosed with that mental health disorder, I'm going to say they may have tendencies of ADHD, but they don't necessarily have it. You can't claim it unless you've been diagnosed. Well, what does this look like? Well, it could be having trouble paying attention. It could be hyperactivity, and this is just in general. It's not a child or an adult. It's just in general. Impulsive behavior. This can create some really poor relationships because, we're not communicating and listening on the same lines when we've been diagnosed with ADHD compared to the general population. This person may have poor work or school or whatever performance. They may have low self-esteem, and there's other problems that can be associated with this as well. I am not a mental health professional. I am just a coach, but I'm going to tell you what I have read since I have studied the ADHD aspect in my efforts to help this client that's dealing with ADHD and the coworker. And oftentimes ADHD appears in early childhood, but it continues into adulthood. It's one of those things that sometimes it isn't diagnosed at an early age. This tends to happen frequently. And the symptoms of ADHD in adults, they aren't always as conclusive and clear as those in ADHD in children. But some of the symptoms continue, like the hyperactivity that looks a little bit different when you're an adult. Struggle with impulsiveness might look a little different when you're an adult. So when you're a child, you may act on impulse, but when you're an adult, those impulses may be different. It could be that you're switching sentences in midterm, and maybe you're taking steps and actions that you wouldn't take because you've been asked not to, and I'm just giving you an example, and you're barging ahead and doing it anyhow just because you feel impulsive in the moment. I'm going to give you an example that my client gave me permission to talk about. She's dealing with a co-worker that has to come to her for advice here and there. They work together with some planning, and sometimes this person with ADHD, and yes, this has been diagnosed, will skip from one sentence to the next. And the person, my client, said she can be busy in the middle of her work, and she can look at this person and say, can we talk about this later? We can meet about this later. Or what exactly do you need? Well, when the person with ADHD starts talking, they'll jump from one subject line to the next in mid-sentence. And my client said she's even said to this person, I'm in the middle of a transaction. I can't stop here. And the person with ADHD may appear to listen for a minute, but then they go back to the same sentence and it's just rambled. It's like writing paragraphs but speaking them without putting periods in there, and you're changing topics, and it's very exhausting. The advice that's given to those with ADHD to communicate better, there's a flip side to this. The number one piece of advice is to communicate face to face. I think on either side of the conversation with the person with ADHD, that communicating face to face has to happen. It's very difficult to communicate through the text because the person with ADHD can jump around a little bit, and they're looking at the prior text and they're looking at the next text, and maybe they're not seeing all of the words, they're not reading it all at once, so they're jumping ahead. Oh, there's more text, and they're jumping ahead. So communicating face to face really does help. Listen actively and don't interrupt. Well, the person with ADHD tends to interrupt, but when we're listening to them talk, we have to let them finish their sentences, as this can be extremely hard to do because we know they're jumping from one thing to the next. But when they're finished, you can look and say, I didn't understand a thing you just said. You ran everything together and I'm sorry, I don't get it. And then repeat back. Have them repeat back to you the point that they're trying to make. And then repeat back to them, to the person with the ADHD, what you heard. This will help keep you out of hot water with this ADHD person and with your boss, for example, because you have spoken back to them what's been said. You might even follow up in writing and say, this was our conversation. Do you agree with me? Repeat back to them in writing what was said. And manage your emotions. This goes on both sides of the coin. The person with ADHD has to manage their emotions because they're maybe going all over the place, hearing different things. But you, as the listener, have to control your emotions as well. Otherwise, you're not going to be a good listener at this point, and you're not going to hear exactly what's being said. You're going to feel before you hear. So you want to avoid that at all costs. So again, I'm going to look at some of the typical ADHD symptoms. Impulsiveness, which we talked about, disorganizations and problems prioritizing, and this is where sometimes the people with ADHD fail to listen to those that are very organized. So you take a really organized person like my client and you side them up with someone with ADHD, and this organized person needs to think about things in a certain sequence, but the person with the ADHD is jumping all over the place. So you have to limit what's being shared there. You have to repeat it. You have to ask a lot of questions. And yes, it can be exhausting, and that's where we have to control our emotions. You have to take a deep breath and be in the moment and say, this isn't my whole entire day, and I'm not going to let this stress me out. Problems focusing on a task. They're jumping from one task to the next when one doesn't even have anything to do with the other oftentimes. There's poor planning. The person with ADHD may love to plan things like events, but because they're poor at planning, they're thinking all over the place instead of planning for that one thing, or that one thing they're not aligning with the times and the correct times to do that planning. It creates some serious planning problems. And the person with ADHD can have a low level for mood swings. You can send them over the moon real easily, or they can go over the moon real easily. You don't do it. They're the ones that allow themselves to do it. But they're swinging here and they're swinging there, and they get frustrated and they get angry. And because they've dealt with this before, they can get themselves involved in some real serious mood swings. Hot temper, that can happen as well. So what my client had said was she had texted and called and had this conversation while she was out of the office with this person with ADHD, and she had told this person, I'll be back in the office, let's sit down and let's have a conversation about this when I get back. In the meantime, the person with ADHD had went to my client's supervisor and had interrupted her day, despite the fact that my client said, let's sit back and have a conversation about this when we can really think clearly and see each other eye to eye, and we'll get this ironed out. But the person with ADHD jumped the gun and thought, well, I'll just do it myself. It created a mess of problems, and it created some frustration in my client because she couldn't handle her job while she was out of the office. She couldn't handle things the way that she felt it would best be handled. She couldn't put her 2 cents in because the person with ADHD jumped the gun. They were too wound up in this and too wound up, period. And so this creates some real issues. My client actually ended up feeling like, how did this conversation go? Was I the one to be made look like I was all over the place? Did my boss really understand the whole situation of what had happened? Or did my boss talk to this person with ADHD and say, look, you're out of line. You need to talk to such and such when she gets back in the office. Then if you need to request a meeting with me, then you can do so. And maybe even send out a text or an email that covers what the conversation that just happened, to repeat back what had been said. So this way, it clears up any doubts that the client had. And it clears up any doubts the ADHD person has. You will meet and you will discuss this. And then if you need to meet with me and include me in this conversation, please do so. But until you've worked on resolving these issues, don't include me. Don't come to me first, especially if such and such has told you, we'll talk about this later. And then the ADHD person may have trouble coping with stress, and his or her stress is going to spread out across those that they need to communicate, whether that be a spouse, whether that be a co-worker. It's the wealth spreads out, whether anyone wants to deal with that or not. So I hope you found this video helpful. I hope that you've gained some insight into how to handle someone with ADHD, Communicate face to face. This goes for both sides of the conversation. Listen actively. Don't interrupt. Always ask questions. Request a repeat. And always manage emotions on both sides of the conversation. And sorry if you can hear that plane going overhead. Anyhow, yes, I think the repeat is so important, especially in an employment situation. Sometimes you just have to stop and write an email and say, hey, this was our conversation, and CC those that are involved, and keep some really good records. It's the only way to keep yourself from being exhausted. It's the only way to keep yourself from looking like you're failing at your job sometimes. You just need to protect yourself. Cover your own rear end. So I hope you found this helpful. And if you did, please click like. And if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do so. And if you know someone that needs this message, sharing is definitely caring. You have a wonderful day. God bless.